It seemed like the perfect escape, a life behind bars, and yet, in 2013, he was released. For years, everyone had believed it was the end. They believed he had been caught, his fate sealed. But the truth was more twisted than anyone could have imagined. On the day he walked out of prison, no one had any idea that the killer they thought was free was still hiding in plain sight.
In 2013, a man named Robert Cole was set free after serving over 20 years for a brutal murder that shocked a small town. It was the kind of case that made headlines across the country. The victim was a young woman named Lucy Martin, a local college student with a bright future. She was found lifeless in her apartment, her death brutal and senseless. The evidence against Robert seemed undeniable: fingerprints, DNA, and a confession. But in the years following his conviction, whispers began to grow. Doubts about Robert's guilt. He was a man who, on the surface, seemed too calm, too collected, too charming for a killer. As the years passed, his case began to gather more questions than answers.
And then, the unthinkable happened. After 2 decades of incarceration, Robert was granted an early release due to new evidence. Evidence that, on its face, seemed to confirm his innocence. No one expected it. The public was divided. Some celebrated his release while others were horrified. Could they really have made a mistake? Was Robert really innocent? Robert Cole returned to the town that once hated him. People whispered when they saw him. He was now a free man, but every glance was filled with suspicion. He moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. But he wasn't hiding. He was just waiting.
For the first few weeks, Robert kept to himself. He visited the same old haunts, the local diner, the barber shop, the park. He spoke to no one. He was quiet, too quiet. But then, something strange happened. People who had known him before, people from his past, began to notice things. Little things, like how his eyes would linger just a moment too long when he passed a certain street corner, or how he never seemed to go to bed before midnight. Then there were the dreams. His neighbors began to hear him shouting in his sleep, shouting Lucy's name. But he kept his distance. He wasn't talking to anyone. Not the police. Not even the friends who'd stood by him during his trial.
As Robert lived his quiet life, the investigation into Lucy's death was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. A team of young, ambitious detectives took on the cold case. They revisited all the evidence, the fingerprints, the DNA, the confession, everything. And then they found it. A detail that no one had ever noticed before. A small, nearly invisible mistake in Robert's confession, something that changed everything. Robert had confessed, yes, but the timeline didn't add up. He had claimed to be at the scene of the crime, but the physical evidence, such as the position of the body and the marks on Lucy's skin, didn't match his story.
The detectives dug deeper. What they uncovered would rock the entire town. The confession had been coerced. Robert hadn't killed Lucy after all. The truth was darker than they could have ever imagined. With the new evidence, the case took a shocking turn. It was clear, Robert Cole was not the killer. He had been a pawn in a twisted game. But if Robert wasn't the killer, then who was?
The detectives traced the real killer to a man who had been in the town all along, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. His name was Peter Redding, a man with no criminal history, someone everyone thought was harmless. But when the police dug into Peter's background, they found a trail of dark secrets. Peter had been close to Lucy before her death, so close, in fact, that no one had ever suspected him.
It was Peter who had made the fatal mistake. He had known Lucy too well, and his obsession with her had turned into something deadly. He had followed Robert's every move, waiting for the perfect time to frame him for a crime he had committed. He had masterminded the entire thing. He had planted evidence. He had set Robert up as the fall guy. And when Robert went to prison, Peter had believed his life was free of the woman who had been haunting him for years.
But the real twist? The one no one could have predicted? Peter had never stopped watching. He had been waiting for the moment when Robert would be released, just so he could finish the job. As the detectives pieced together the truth, they realized that Peter wasn't just some random killer. No, Peter was a mastermind, one who had orchestrated the entire thing for years. And now, with Robert back on the streets, Peter was desperate to cover his tracks before the truth came out.
Robert, who had once been the hunted, was now the one with the answers. But he didn't trust anyone, not even the police. Robert knew that if Peter realized he was on to him, things would get dangerous. Robert had nothing to lose anymore, and he was going to take matters into his own hands. But when Robert went to confront Peter, things didn't go according to plan. He was not prepared for the horror he found waiting for him. As the hours passed, the tension continued to build. No one knew what was going to happen next, but one thing was for sure. The truth was about to be revealed, and when it was, it would shatter everything.
Robert Cole wasn't ready for the confrontation that awaited him. His entire life, he had been a prisoner, falsely accused, and now free. But he wasn't truly free, was he? The twisted puzzle pieces of his past, the horrific murder of Lucy, had been buried deep in his mind, locked away behind years of bitter isolation. But now, those same pieces were creeping back, closing in around him, suffocating him.
The phone call from Detective Parker still rang in his mind. "We know you weren't the killer, Robert, but someone is still out there. Someone's been hiding in plain sight this whole time." Robert could barely understand the words as they echoed in his brain. He was still reeling from the shock that his entire life, everything he had endured in prison, had been for nothing. He hadn't been the murderer. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but the realization didn't ease the tension in his chest. It only made it worse. The questions, they didn't stop. Who killed Lucy Martin? Why had he been framed?
The answers to these questions would push Robert to the edge. What had he uncovered in the dark recesses of his own life? The more he learned, the more impossible it seemed to avoid the truth. He wasn't just a pawn. He was the pawn in a game far more twisted than he had ever imagined. Robert's confrontation with Peter Redding didn't unfold in a dramatic showdown. There were no gunshots, no explosions, just a quiet, sinister exchange. Robert knew Peter's habits. He had studied him for months. Peter would be at his apartment, the same one he had lived in for years. It was late when Robert arrived. He watched from the shadows as Peter moved about, unaware of the looming danger. The old house was eerily silent. The wind howled outside, but inside, the only sound was the soft click of the door handle as Peter let himself into his apartment. Robert approached slowly, step by step. There was no rush now. He had time. The truth was going to come out one way or another. As Robert crossed the threshold into Peter's world, he felt the weight of years of injustice pressing on him. He had been a pawn, but now he was in control. He needed answers.
He crept through the house, the dark walls of Peter's place swallowing him whole. His breath shallow, Robert's heart raced as he approached the living room. The curtains were drawn tight, the room cloaked in shadows. But as he stepped forward, Robert froze. A shadow moved. He wasn't alone. Peter, standing by a cracked window, held a glass in his hand, his back turned. He hadn't heard Robert's approach. "Did you think you'd get away with it, Peter?" Robert's voice was quiet, cold. Peter turned slowly, his face pale as the blood drained from it. There was no trace of shock, only a hint of a smirk. "You never could have known the full truth, Robert. It was never about you."
That's when Robert knew. The person he had once considered a friend, an innocent bystander in his life, had orchestrated everything. Peter wasn't just the murderer. He was the architect.
"You were never meant to be the victim, Robert. You were meant to be the fall guy," Peter said, his voice low, as though savoring each word.
"I never killed Lucy," Robert replied, the weight of his words sinking into the thick silence between them. "You framed me."
Peter's smirk grew wider, more sinister. Framed? Number, you were the perfect decoy. I needed someone with a history, someone who could take the fall. You never knew you were just a puppet.
It hit Robert like a freight train. Peter hadn't just manipulated him. He had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes. The confession, the planted evidence, the coerced witness statements, all of it had been part of a game Peter had been playing from the very start. But what shook Robert to his core wasn't just the confession, it was the reason behind it.
I wasn't just setting you up, Robert. I was preparing you for something bigger. You were always meant to be a part of it.
What? Robert's voice faltered as the words sank in. What do you mean?
Peter stepped closer, the glass in his hand clinking ominously. I was never in charge. You think I framed you? Number, someone else has always been pulling the strings, someone much darker than you can imagine.
Robert's world spun as Peter's words sank in. Someone else? Who?
Peter's smirk faded, and for the first time, Robert saw fear in his eyes. It's too late for you. It's too late for both of us. You were the last piece of the puzzle, Robert. And now, they're coming for us. The hairs on the back of Robert's neck stood up. Who was Peter talking about? Who could be behind all of this? As Robert tried to process what was happening, he heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Peter's eyes widened in terror. He turned to Robert, his voice desperate. Get out now! You don't understand what you've done!
Before Robert could ask another question, the door to the living room creaked open, and Robert froze. Two men stepped in, their faces obscured by shadows. They were tall, imposing. Their presence filled the room, making the air thick with fear. Peter's face twisted in a grimace as he backed away. I told you it was too late. Robert didn't have time to process their identities. He only knew one thing. He had been caught in something much darker than he could have imagined. And now, he was no longer just a victim. He was part of the game, the real game.
Robert stood frozen in the living room, the heavy silence broken only by the soft, deliberate steps of the two figures in the doorway. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the world around him. His mind raced, but his body refused to move, locked in place by the terror that had gripped him ever since he heard Peter's revelation. Too late, he couldn't shake those words. What did they mean? Who were these people? One of the men took a step forward, his face still hidden by shadows. The air in the room felt suffocating as he locked eyes with Robert, and for the briefest moment, Robert felt a sense of déjà vu, like he'd seen this man before. But where?
The other man stayed still, his hand resting casually on the doorframe, his posture rigid and unreadable. But the first man, the one moving closer, had a sharp, calculating presence, a predator's gaze. Robert instinctively knew this man wasn't just any thug. He was something worse. Peter, his face ashen, stepped backward, visibly trembling. I told you, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Robert's heart raced, the tension in the air almost unbearable. Who are they, Peter? What is this all about?
Peter's eyes darted around the room, and for a second Robert thought he might finally get an answer. But Peter's lips only curled into a bitter sneer, and he backed away toward the corner, as though distancing himself from the danger now surrounding them. The man at the door didn't speak at first, letting the moment stretch on, building the suspense until it was nearly unbearable. Then slowly he took a step forward, and for the first time, Robert saw the man's face.
It was too familiar. Robert's stomach churned. It couldn't be him. But it was. The man in front of him was none other than Detective Tom Davis, the man who had supposedly been investigating Lucy's murder, the same detective who had been so eager to clear Robert's name. Davis? Robert whispered in disbelief. You were behind all of this? Detective Davis's lips parted in a faint smirk, a smile that sent a cold chill crawling up Robert's spine. You've been so focused on the wrong thing, Robert. he said, his voice calm, almost pitying. This wasn't ever about you being framed. It was about you being a tool, a pawn. Robert's mind reeled. A pawn? But I've been in prison for years. How could I have been a pawn?
The other man stepped into the light then, revealing a face that sent a sharp jolt of recognition through Robert. It was Marcus Cole, a notorious figure from Robert's past, a man who had once made his life a nightmare when they had crossed paths in prison. But what was Marcus doing here? Marcus's lips stretched into a twisted grin as he locked eyes with Robert. "You really didn't know, did you?" Marcus said, his voice dripping with disdain. "All these years you were just playing your part, thinking you were the one in control."
Robert's chest tightened, his breathing shallow. This can't be happening. This is a nightmare. I don't understand. The words fell out of Robert's mouth, more desperate than he intended. How could you do this? Why would you do this? To me? To Lucy? Why kill her?
Detective Davis leaned in slightly, his face suddenly filled with a kind of cruel amusement. "Oh, Lucy wasn't the target, Robert. She was just a casualty. The real game was always you." Marcus stepped forward, his grin widening. "The truth is, you were never supposed to be anything more than a pawn in this twisted little chess game. You see, Davis and I, well, we've been working together for a long time. You were just the perfect fall guy. You were chosen."
Robert felt his legs wobble beneath him. His mind was scrambling to make sense of what was happening, but the pieces just wouldn't fit. Chosen for what?
"You were supposed to be the sacrifice," Davis continued, his voice growing darker. "But things got a little out of hand, didn't they? You weren't supposed to remember any of this. But then you started digging, and that's when you ruined everything."
Robert's eyes darted between the two men, but his thoughts were a jumbled mess. Sacrifice? He hadn't asked for any of this. His life had been ripped apart by a crime he didn't commit, and now he was being told that everything, every moment of pain, had been orchestrated for a purpose he couldn't even begin to understand.
Peter, cowering in the corner, watched the scene unfold, his expression a mix of regret and fear. "You're both insane," he said, his voice trembling. "This wasn't the plan. It wasn't supposed to go this way."
Plan? Marcus scoffed. There's no plan anymore. It's too late for all of us. Robert didn't have time to think, only to act. He bolted for the door, pushing past the men. He didn't know where he was going, but he needed to get out of there. No one is controlling me anymore. But as his hand reached the doorknob, he felt a firm grip on his shoulder. He spun around to face Detective Davis, who was now standing inches from him. The man's eyes were cold, devoid of the humanity Robert had once trusted.
"You can't escape this, Robert," Davis said quietly, his voice like steel. "You're already too far in. You'll never be free."
Robert's mind spun. Was this the end? Had his entire life been a trap, a game he didn't know he was playing? As he struggled to break free from Davis's grip, a loud crash came from outside the room, followed by frantic footsteps. Someone was running through the house.
Then in a flash, the door to the living room burst open and a shadowy figure stormed in. Robert couldn't make out who it was, but they moved with purpose, as if they'd been waiting for this exact moment. The room was silent for a second. Then in the blink of an eye, everything changed. Boom.
Don't forget to comment, and for more videos, please subscribe to our channel.